Our world is rapidly changing in many different areas of life. One of the aspects of our global challenges that we're currently facing is climate change. And climate change, I think a lot of people are surprised by how fast climate change is coming. I think when we were doing modeling in the early 2000s, we were looking at 2050, 2070 for certain things, and these things are coming at us way quicker than we had imagined. So when you look at climate change and then you zoom in into an area like the SLOCAN Valley, then one of the things that happens here is that we have an increase in likelihood of wildfire.
We're seeing a lot more catastrophic fires in Canada and around the world. You have to understand the background, what we need for fire. So there's three ingredients for fire. The fuel, that's the stuff that burns, the needles, the leaves, the grass, the trees, how much you have, what type, how dry it is, really important. You need ignition, people and lightning, and you need appropriate weather, hot, dry, windy weather. So when you get all three, you can have high intensity fire. The catastrophic part comes into when you get this intersection between fire and society. And it will happen, it does happen. We've seen Fort McMurray, the largest natural disaster in Canadian history, and we've seen the fires in California. The impacts are increasing, and we're seeing it in Canada, around the world, because there's more people on the landscape, more value on the landscape, and there's more fire because our climate is changing.
We know that there was a lot of fire on the Western North American landscape. It's a landscape of fire. It's born of fire. It develops a life history with fire. That plants and animals are adapted to fire. They know how to make a living around fire. The key idea, if anybody comes away from our conversations here, is we spent a century trying to react to fire really, really potently and to try to put it in a box. And the fact of the matter is that's a failed proposition. It doesn't mean we stop doing fire suppression. We still have a highly motivated and effective suppression workforce. It means we start living proactively with wildfire and learn how to more and more literally live with wildfire, because it's not going away. There is no low smoke, low fire scenario on the table for us, and we got to embrace that. And I think we can, actually. I think it's a hopeful message. We have tools, we have building blocks. What we need to do is get people to work together to go in that direction.
I think one thing that's very important for people to understand is that fire is part of a natural, healthy ecosystem. It's not something that you eliminate. It's something that you have to learn to live with. And the problem that we're facing right now is that it's really hard to live with it because when it comes, it's so destructive. So we cannot imagine that we will prepare our community for fire that will never come. We have to imagine that we're preparing our communities for fire that is coming.
We're the first generations in North America to not live well with fire. For 10,000 years, people learned how to live with fire, and we didn't. And we've only been around a pretty short period of time. That's a little bit crazy when you think about it, right? There's a lot to learn. If you're in a fire-prone landscape, how do I live with it? How do I be clever with fire? How do I use it to my fullest advantage? That's the question we need to start asking, not how do we make it go away? There's no making it go away.
Forest that we're experiencing today that a lot of people think is natural forest is actually not natural, because fire used to be part of the cycle and we've removed that from the cycle. We did a lot of things that historically were not present in a native culture. The native culture actually used fire as a tool.
I believe that indigenous fire was even more overwhelming influence than lightning in North America. And that's natural. I mean, when we talk about natural fire, we're talking about human fire. And we had large populations of First Nations, indigenous people in North America. So that natural landscape, in a lot of places, it didn't have a lot of trees. And it was very open, and what trees were there were very fire tolerant. They were large diameter, they were tall, they had thick bark, gaps in places, clumps of trees, lots more hardwood, shrub, herb ecosystems. Not at all like what we have today. These are very unnatural landscapes. They are almost 180 degrees from what they were. Climate change is going to deliver us bigger fires, longer fire seasons, more smoke, more cost, more cultural and economic and environmental impacts, and we have to change the way we manage the land.
We will have a SLOCAN Valley event in the next decade or two for sure. It's coming, and we're not talking about centuries here. We're talking about, within our lifetimes for most of us, we're going to experience a fire event. When there is a fire, the fires will want to enter our communities. And are we prepared for that? And the SLOCAN Valley Wildfire Resiliency Program is all about us knowing what we can do around our homes so that when the fire wants to enter our community, it does not necessarily impact us negatively. It's hard to imagine, but if we do the work, it's actually a real possibility that we would have a fire that's traveling, that's intense. There's the ember showers that are traveling for kilometers. The fire comes close to our communities. SIFCo has been doing a lot of work around the communities, so we have defendable spaces. The fire hit those defendable spaces, slows down, maybe even moves to the ground. We're still being bombarded with ember showers, but each home within the community has known that that was coming and has prepared themselves for it. So when the ember shower comes, we've done the work. So we can withstand that ember shower. And the ember shower tends to only last 3-4 hours, and then it's gonna go. But that 3-4 hours can destroy a village completely, or that 3-4 hours can be a momentary, uncomfortable experience. But when we come back, our community is still standing. And that's the goal. The goal is to, when we do experience that moment, that we see it as an inconvenience, but we don't look back, and what we look back at is a village that used to be and that isn't anymore.
SIFCo has been doing a lot of work in fuel management, maintaining forest ecosystems, standing trees, but reducing the fuel load under them. We think it is a key aspect of building a fire resilient and climate change resilient landscape in the West Kootenays. From a wildfire perspective, the SLOCAN Valley is a high-risk situation. It's a lovely green space that in some days of the year will burn in a 30-foot tall wall of flame. That gives us a high element of risk. We also, in much of the valley, have one way in and one way out. Our evacuation process, when a wildfire occurs, is going to be a challenge. We have dead-end roads. If the wildfire cuts the road, we have people up the hill who have no way to escape. We think the only positive thing we can do is reduce the chance of landscape level, high intensity wildfire. That's talking about fuel management.
The likelihood of wildfire coming and the likelihood of them being catastrophic when they come is increasing exponentially year to year. So we need to have an approach that takes that as reality. Like, we cannot live assuming that it's just not going to come. We have to live assuming that it's coming. So we need to approach it as individuals. We need to approach it as land managers. We need to approach it as governments. So all the layers of social organization need to be involved in the challenges that are coming our way. And when you look at it from a land manager's perspective, which is SIFCo's lens, then you're looking at landscape level fuel management as what becomes obvious. Then you need to zoom in and look at it from a home owner's perspective. What happens when there's a wildfire 2 kilometers from your home? What happens when there's a wildfire 5 kilometers from your home? What do you need to do when the event is happening? How can you prepare yourself? But also, what do you need to do a year, 2 years, 3 years before the event? What are the things that you can put in place that when something like that happens in our community, you know that you've done everything that you could do to prepare yourself, and you also are ready to respond to the event?
It's important that all of the dwellings in a community move towards greater resiliency. House-to-house fire transmission is a reality. We don't want that to happen. Everyone really does need to get on board to reduce the chances of wildfire causing a structure fire inside a community.
The SLOCAN Valley Wildfire Resiliency Program has been working in partnership with the villages of SLOCAN, Silverton, and New Denver to help raise awareness and to educate the residents about wildfire mitigation efforts they can take on their property. Preparing these communities requires homeowners to engage in wildfire mitigation practices around their home. The first step in this process is education. A great resource that SIFCo is providing is a free home assessment by a local FireSmart representative. During a home assessment, the representative will offer the homeowner practical steps that can be taken to help mitigate wildfire risk. So let's take a look at some of the steps involved in a home assessment from a local FireSmart representative.
Today we're going to look at structure and how we can lower our risks from the fire embers accompanying a wildfire event. We're going to look at different aspects of a home, different sections of the home, and point out some areas that would be vulnerable to embers or firebrands when they travel through the air and they land on structures.
When assessing a home, we break up the area around the home into zones. Zone 1A, Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3. Zone 1A is the first 1.5 meters from the structure. This is a non-combustible zone. Zone 1, which is 1.5 meters to 10 meters from the structure. Zone 2, which is 10 to 30 meters from the structure. And Zone 3, which is 30 to 100 meters from the structure.
So now let's look at a few different structures and ways we can mitigate and reduce risk overall. Starting with the roofing, as you can see, this home has a metal roof. If you have a non-combustible roof, you've reduced your risk overall to your structure by about half. So we want to start there on the roof because fire embers that travel through the air end up hitting the roof first, usually, or the side of the building. So these are the two areas we really want to focus on. Fires that start in the attic are really hard to combat as a firefighter, so we really want to protect that roofing structure. When we talk about different classes of roofs, we usually split them up into 3 different levels: Class A, Class B, or Class C. A Class A roof is a roof that is made out of a material that can resist a higher degree of heat and flame. This would include a metal roof, a ceramic roof, asphalt shingle roof, or concrete. A Class B roof is a material that has a fire retardant or properties added to it to make it more resistive to heat and flame. Class B roofs aren't as good as Class A roofs because basically they're a Class C roofing material with fire retardant added to it. Class C roof would be the wood shingles or cedar shingles that you would see on a roofing system. Non-factory, non-retardant soaked wood shingles. Class C would provide very little protection if exposed to flame or embers.
Working our way down from the roof, we come across the fascia and soffits. People ask what the difference is. The fascia is the part that faces you. In this case, it's the brown or burgundy color, and the soffits are the section underneath.
As you can tell, the fascias and soffits on this structure are all metal, which encapsulates the eaves and protects the eaves from fire embers and firebrands getting into the attic zone.
And I wanted to point out an issue that is of importance: the separation of the fascia off the eaves here. Fire embers can find their way into these little nooks in the roofing structures, so it's really important to keep up with maintenance. You want to keep your eaves and your soffits nicely sealed so that fire embers cannot gain access into the attic area.
So vinyl and plastic gutters are another important point that we need to address. Wildfire embers love to collect in gutters, so it's important to keep your gutters clear of materials such as leaves and twigs. From the roof and eave structure, we come across the windows. The windows on this structure are, for the most part, double pane, secure windows. We have the odd single pane window here, which is an issue. If you have radiant heat, these single pane windows will not survive, they will crack. So when you're thinking about upgrading windows, upgrade them into a double pane window. This will help reduce the risk of fire getting into structures. So now we're moving on to another common vulnerable area on structures, and they happen to be vents. Wildfire embers can gain access into these areas, so we're recommending screening them with a metal mesh, 1/8 inch or 3 millimeter screen to prevent wildfires getting in through these vent areas. I wanted to point out this typical dryer vent that a lot of structures have, and as I reach up under here, I pull down One of the most famous fire starter, the lint. This lint ends up lining on the inside of this vent cover is definitely an issue. So keeping this area clean, making sure that the flap in here closes and shuts freely, also will protect from wildfires gaining access into the structure through vents.
So another common section at the home that we need to address is the garage doors. Fire embers can get in through this area, especially when there are gaps in the seal that goes around the garage door, and if there's any gaps at the base of the door. It is important to make sure your garage door is well maintained and any gaps around the door are sealed, so wildfire embers cannot gain access through your garage door. It is important to look over the exterior of your home and to find any gaps where wildfire embers could gain access to the structure. Closing these off will help protect your home from ignition.
Even though this stoop is concrete, we have a vulnerable area just below the door here. As you can see, Mother Nature has done her due diligence of depositing small, fine fuels at the crack that is below this door. Wildfire embers will blow in, hit the door, and drop and collect at that certain spot.
Mitigating these areas by keeping them clean and protecting the bottom plate with a non-combustible material such as a metal or hardy plank will help protect this area. It's important to talk about siding material choices. Non-combustible siding would include stucco, metal, concrete board, or hardy plank. An example of combustible siding would be wood or vinyl siding. If you do have combustible siding, it's important to install this minimum 6-inch non-combustible flashing on the siding at all of the wall-ground junctions. So if embers do collect, the chance of them igniting the siding is significantly reduced.
This home has stucco siding. When wildfire embers would hit this wall, they would drop to this junction. If embers were to build up in this area, it would not ignite this wall. If this home had cedar shingle siding or wood siding, the embers that would build up would have enough radiant heat to be able to ignite that siding on fire. By placing a 6-inch non-combustible flashing around the bottom where that junction meets would help protect the structure. Decks on homes are a particular issue for FireSmart. As you can see with this deck, it is open to the underneath of the deck. Underneath we have leaves and combustibles. Part of the home maintenance program is making sure that all combustible dry leaves and fine fuels are removed from under deck areas and closing off those deck areas to prevent wildfire embers from gaining access. In order to prevent decks from igniting and causing a structure fire, closing off the gaps in between the steps with skirting is required. The skirting should be non-combustible. With the skirting in place, we still have to be vigilant about removing the fine fuels that always seem to collect underneath decks. During a wildfire evacuation alert, it's important to recognize things that are on your deck open to the elements that are combustible. Cushions and pillows and materials that could easily be ignited by wildfire embers have to be moved inside the home. Another very common design is the bamboo blind. Wildfire embers can easily attach themselves to the bamboo blind and ignite. This would be a fuel load right underneath the eaves. It's important to remove this material during a wildfire evacuation alert.
So as we move down the walls into Zone 1A, which is 1.5 meters from the edge of the structure, we come across a very common issue. We have piles of debris, trees, and bushes right up against the house. Ideally, we want to create a non-combustible border going around the home. For example, rock, gravel, or mineral soil, basically removing anything that could lead a fire towards a structure.
Keep vegetation in Zone 1A well irrigated and to a minimum height. Ideally, you want to remove all conifers and highly flammable vegetation next to structures.
When looking at grass links next to the structure, we want to keep them below 10 centimeters. We also want to keep the grass irrigated to prevent it from turning into fine fuels, which could allow the fire to crawl towards the structure.
So as we move into Zone 1, which is 1.5 meters to 10 meters from the structure, we look at other structures and possible fuel loads. In this particular instance, we have a typical shed and it's within Zone 1. It's actually within 7 meters, so it's within that 10-meter distance from the home. When a structure is within 10 meters of the home, the same principles are applied to the secondary structures as the main structure on the property to help prevent structure-to-structure ignition. It's very common for residences and homeowners to have open carports like the one here. The structure that we're in happens to be within Zone 1, so 30 feet of the main structure. On the shelf you can see some combustible materials. Wildfire embers can get into these sheds and ignite these combustible materials. By closing off these sheds and treating them like the main housing structure, we will reduce our risk from structure to structure transmission.
Another very common and important thing to discuss is stored firewood. Any firewood that is stored next to a structure becomes part of a structure. Stored firewood is a large fuel load, therefore storing firewood outside of Zone 1 during fire season is highly recommended. That means leaving it at the edge of your property, and after wildfire season is over, come October, you can bring your firewood in closer to your home.
Now that we have discussed the structure, Zone 1A and Zone 1, we move into Zone 2, which is 10 to 30 meters from the structure. In Zone 2, we are going to discuss crown continuity, ground and ladder fuels, and how we can mitigate the risks they may cause to your structure.
In Zone 2, it is important to reduce crown continuity. Crown continuity is the clustering of tree tops that creates a fire line in the canopy of trees. This is an issue because if fire gets into the treetops, it can easily spread into the neighboring trees and increase the intensity and rate of spread of the fire. We can lower the risk of a crown fire near our homes by spacing trees at least 3 meters apart from the ends of the branches or 9 meters apart at the base.
It is also important to reduce ground fuels in the Zone 2 area. Ground fuels are light to medium fuels which accumulate on the ground around your home. Examples of these would include grasses, twigs, leaves, yard waste, fallen trees, or anything on the ground that could be flammable and lead the fire towards the structure or other fuel loads. During the hot, dry summer season, these ground fuels already tend to be pretty dry, making them highly ignitable, which can in turn create a fire line towards the structure. Removing these ground fuels will help to prevent fire crawling towards structures or other fuel loads. Wildfires travel from point of ignition to point of ignition. What facilitates this ignition transfer is ladder fuels. As fire burns on the ground, it can crawl up these ladder fuels and get into the upper canopy of trees. We can mitigate these ladder fuels by creating breaks in the continuity of these ladder fuels. By removing shrubs, low-lying branches, and tall grasses, we've created that fire break between the ground and the tree canopy. By addressing crown continuity, ground fuels, and ladder fuels, we have greatly reduced our risk from fire further crawling towards our structures. Moving out from Zone 2, we come to Zone 3, which is 30 to 100 meters from the structure. In Zone 3, we are continuing to reduce crown continuity, ground and ladder fuels. We do this by spacing trees 9 meters apart at the base, or 3 meters apart from branch end to branch end. We continue to remove ground fuels that could allow the fire to crawl towards other fuel loads. And we remove ladder fuels such as small conifers and low-lying branches to prevent fire from entering the tree canopy. Pruning branches up to the 2-meter mark is ideal. By reducing the ground fuels, ladder fuels, and crown continuity in Zone 2 and 3, we greatly reduce the speed and intensity of the wildfire. So let's recap on the suggested mitigation steps we have discussed in each zone. In Zone 3, we start that fire break process. We reduce crown continuity, ground fuels, and ladder fuels. In Zone 2, we increase those efforts by removing more crown continuity, more ground fuels, and ladder fuels. In Zone 1, we've eliminated all ground fuels, ladder fuels, and crown continuities. In Zone 1A, we have created a non-combustible border around our structures. to prevent fire crawling. And we've protected our structures so that embers can collect but not ignite the home. These are just some of the steps that we can take in order to help lower the risk of structural loss in the event of a wildfire.
For more information on how to further protect your home, visit www.firesmart.ca or www.SIFCo.ca/fire.
Given that we will be living with fires, we need the residents involved, we need interagency cooperation, we need emergency preparedness, we need all these elements to come together so that we begin to have an overall plan in case of a wildfire. We're prepared, we're ready, we knew it was coming, we're not surprised, and we're acting the way that we should act in those events. We tend to, as a human family, to react. Something happens and then we panic and it's happening, but then when you step back after the event, you go, there's so much I could have done ahead of time. And SLOCAN Valley Wildfire Resiliency Program is based on that idea. Devastation of ecosystem is real. Loss of life is real. It is happening as we speak around the world, and it could be happening here. And if we don't do anything, we'll be victims of it one day. So this is what this program is all about.
Individuals are in the end the most important part of the whole pyramid. They're us. What individuals choose to do governs whether or not we manage to get to a fire resilient place in our communities, in our local areas, and around our own homes. Individual action, individual empowerment, and individual choices are what's vital to this whole program.